Without trying to get into the various things written on the cover, I will start by saying that Shariah and Shariat law is not exactly the same thing. The rulings of the past are people's personal rulings, and they may agree, or they may not, or they may be particularly okay in some certain circumstances, but not a universal thing. The idea that Sharia developed after the death of Prophet Muhammad is more or less nonsensical, but the understanding and application of the duties to God and the duties to the rest of creation is a living thing. A lot of the so-called understandings are more of political functions than they are direct understandings. This author does use his own translations in places. There is more to it than just mimicking the prophetic example, because certainly if you understand it in its context, then it's applicable to more than just a particular place and time. Some differences occur between practicing Islamic law as a minority and as a majority. Some must go along with those in charge, and some must strive for the change. That striving is jihad, which is not a term that means holy war in Arabic. The presence of religious law does not mean that some things will be forced. It doesn't mean that there won't be exceptions to spare a life when it comes to some things. And certainly it doesn't mean certain exaggerations. Islam does not believe in free mixing of the sexes, but that doesn't mean that there can't be a co-ed class, or that the police have to wait for an officer of the same gender, or a medical emergency can only be attended by somebody of the same gender, and that sort of stuff. And it doesn't mean there can't be pluralism. It doesn't mean that there's some lack of individuality, even at the masajid. Now, in the mosques, we do have some rules, but a lot of these rules are, for the mosque. And as far as democracy, well, Islam is more open to democracy than Western society, which, you vote, but the elite get to pick your people. In Islam, they regard the qualifications, not how wealthy are the sponsors of the individual. So perhaps you could say that the countries that say that certain politicians have to meet certain qualifications. If you look at how things used to work in Asia and in Europe, there was something called chivalry. So there was a service nobility. The kings and stuff even had to fight the battles. They had to fight with the army, or their sons did, or something. In India, it was the same thing. You didn't have the rulers say, go to war, go to war, go to war, and then they didn't fight the war. Now, there's principles Islam sets forth that pretty much condemns almost every war, but, And it doesn't matter how mainstream or popular or whatever something is. If it's supported, it's supported. If it's not, it's not. And so I would not call people by terms that are not self-designating unless there's something about their self-designation that's problematic, separate from reality, or expresses a belief that you don't want to affirm by stating that self-designation. We can be present in a society and live their style according to our principles. Too much fighting it or too much going along with it continues to cause problems. And then people blame it on religion when it's not religion at all, and the secular issues even more so. And perhaps we should distinguish certain groups and the Islamic movements themselves. The Muwahideen are Salaf as-Saleh, or whatever other term you may have for them that's not their own term. They're not the same thing as the first, second, or third Saudi kingdom. They're not the same thing as the Iranian Revolution to throw out the Zionist oppressor. There were issues with that, but certain freedoms, like the ability to play chess. Now, in Islam, the rule is no games of chance, no gambling. So it's not quite the same thing as a ban on chess. But then again, it's not something that is enforced by the state. Yeah, if someone's going to start playing certain games in a masjid, the people in charge of the masjid will have them stop. But, like you can tell in the streets of Iran, they do not require hijab. You got the hair sticking out of the top and stuff like this, and this is not quite to the full modesty for a woman that you're not related to in public. But does the state enforce it? No. Now, if you go to a prayer service, that's a different story. Then you hear that they do enforce it. But if you go to a temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you have to wear the white and others very specific clothing that they say you have to wear. You have to cover exactly what they say you have to cover, or you're not taking part in it. Other less closed religious services, still, they hold that right. There are a lot of hadith books and tafsirs and Mungazi and secondary sources of Islamic law. So therefore, you may not be familiar with the justification of a particular practice. You may call it bid'ah, but if it doesn't go against what Islam has taught, if it doesn't change the rules and all that stuff, even for example, the Shia teach that A'imma had no right to change the religion that Muhammad came with. Now, whether that is actual or not in a particular marja or whatever, that is whatever, but the sectarian differences, whether they're real or just surface political things, because the difference isn't really quite the same thing as political, or these are more Persian and these are more Arab, because the majority of Muslims are neither. But the point is, there's been infighting, and some stuff like Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Abdul Wahhab, there are some issues that you can actually subscribe to them. Some things that you can actually attribute to the Khawarij. But it's important to know what's actual and what's not. Islam encourages philosophy, it encourages the beauty of life, but it doesn't make things about, quoting people with some thoughts, right? That's not what they mean by indulgence in philosophy. Opinions vary when it comes to the various types of narration. Like, for example, in terms of order of their historical appearance, we have the Abadi, which when they look at the traditions, they just say, is it actually a tradition that is being passed around in our community? And you can look at some of them will say that this is from this area, and there are recordings of it, but it's not quite as strict. The Shia, they wanted to know exactly who was passing this stuff on, exactly who said it, and it's presumed that if it comes from A'imma, then it's, the closest student of the Prophet, and then so on and so on, and that's how it was passed on. The Sunni also, they're more open to more people in the community, but they're very particular about every person on the chain. They want to find out the history of that. Like, for example, there's some very controversial stuff that does appear. Like, there's one narration in Bukhari that, in context with what's else said in Bukhari, that's, it's not quite true. Of course, there was always another interpretation of, oh, that's the number of years since, not birth, but whatever. But that same narrator narrates 10 in addition to 9. So they said 19 when they were younger. And everybody who learned from them when they were younger said that this person passed on this. Now the Sufis, just like the Sunnis, will pass on stories related to the people who knew the Prophet and knew the various sheikhs and stuff like this, and record some of that information. And the Sufis tend to be more into the gestures and stuff related to that. But for the most part, they all agree. And if you look at what the Prophet said about the 73 sects and the one that got it right, as long as you are looking at what the Prophet taught, as long as you, whether it's the Revelation, the Quran, and a few select other things, or it's the inspired sayings, this will guide you. And, you can use your situation and your intellect to direct you towards whatever. But a lot of people, does that mean you reject? You say, maybe you don't know about all these other people's rulings. And certainly, but it helps. It helps to read books like this and other such things, because maybe they have realized something or understood something that you haven't. And by you looking at it, you're like, wait a second, this does do this, and I'd never noticed that before. Or it gives you an idea, okay, these other people think this, and there's reason for them to think this, and, they're upon that. Religion is a life's work of figuring out what is real and not real, and what to do about it in relationship with all. It's beyond memorization. It's beyond grouping some understandings in an actualization. It's not always aesthetically pleasing. It is self-modernizing. And I don't mean the flexing sensibilities. It's beyond sensibilities in a way, because whatever you feel, whatever your emotions, it's like, okay, but it's what you choose to do about these various things. It accepts history and the other sciences for what they are. It doesn't have to approve of everything that's attributed to a group or an individual that is called Muslim. From one's student stage of life, seclusion, or marriage, it has answers to it all. Any failure towards Shariah law is the fault of the human. Whether that's inward or outward, we can more than tolerate. We can look at what was done with other cultures and think, well, what is the Islamic equivalent of this? Now, as detailed as the Talmudim and canon law and all that can be, it's been my experience and my consideration of the sources that I have been able to witness. Islam is far broader reaching. Hence, I said, it's self-modernizing. You don't have to wait for some fatwa. And of course, you need to be careful of the idea of just, law is just some judge comes up with a rule. I like something that the Pakistanis have in their constitution is something to the effect of delegative more than legislative authority, and something also to the fact that nothing is to contradict Quran and Sunnah. So any attempt to force the Qadiani or whatever else not to be Qadiani, it's like, well, it's their choice to be that, no matter how deviant you consider their group to be. It still amounts to, they're going too far in what they have said with that, because they really do believe that Muhammad is a prophet and stuff that he taught other than the Quran. So some of them are much closer than your average person who goes to another mosque. I'm not saying there's not issues Islamically with the Ahmadi groups, but I am saying that, some countries go too far with dealing with them. And, of course, if you look at actual apostasy, I don't say it's outdated, this and other, because Islam never allowed fighting to get slaves. And certainly slaves were treated better than you expect employees to be treated. So a lot of the stuff you hear, it's like, it's a buzzword. When we admit that something is fiqh, we are admitting that it is an understanding. So if any flaw is exposed in it, then then it's not blamed on deity or religion itself. Now, some people, or in some cases, the rulings will be more based on reason and ethics. And in other cases, it will be strictly the morals of the text. And of course, you're going to come across different categories of things and different judgments on what is not as universally agreed upon. Anything from the forbidden to the neutral, to the obliged, to the encouraged, to the disliked, but not exactly forbidden. And, well, who dislikes it anyways, right? In a matter of speaking, you end up with some different issues, right? You have the idea that there's no further development. It's like, in a way, yes, the religion's perfect, but it's just applied more and more as the time goes on, or it's applied to different material and psychological culture. The development is in the human being, is in the group, not in the religion. So, and as far as sound bites, it's a very difficult thing to talk about, right? In some respects, it's the very deterioration of some things that forms the issue. There wouldn't be the issue with Islamic law if some things were not in place with it, or some things were not taken away from it. Everybody wants to be free from the blame of what others do. They have ideals of what could be accomplished by someone. And if these ideas go around, it becomes possible. But in Islam, we're only responsible for what we're actually able to do ourselves. A lot of people will claim to be progressive, but they're really regressing and taking away of the religious and family values. They're failing to bring the principles into what they may consider different psychological and material circumstances. So how are they progressing if they're not going forward? They're just taking things off, right? Everybody needs to go beyond what has been done unto them and only act as is right for them to do unto others. We defend what is right rather than who is considered to be of our side. And when people blaspheme or make false claims or whatever, we address these things reasonably. We can enjoy ourselves and all that, but the point is not to form what is shocking or what stirs up, right? Now, if you look into a lot of the so-called claims about the Muslim majority countries, let's forget the Zionist control and infiltration and all that other stuff. There is definitely responsibility for people's own decisions and giving up as a society or giving in or whatever you're going to call it. But let's be real with some stuff. As far as the absolute, they're forcing the hijab, or hijab's not the same thing as a headscarf. You know, that's not the same thing. Or, they punish somebody for being raped. No, they punish them for their own crimes. They may have found out about some crimes in some instances because of a person's particular being victimized, but it doesn't mean that they are punished for being victimized. And there have been some faulty judges that won't accept the evidence that's right there in front of them. But that doesn't, as I said, popular and political Islam are not arguments that we should ever be making, because it's either actual or it's not. Not, it happens in a Muslim majority country. It's like the thing with the ritual genital mutilation of females. Well, the most common incident of that, the highest percentage of people who that's done to is in Christian areas of Africa and Jewish communities. So, that doesn't pan out. Islam, as I said, it's, for nature. It's not against nature. And of course, we need to distinguish between circumcision, subincision, and root castration, or whatever the specific medical terms that you may be familiar with when it comes to those things. When it happens to one gender, it happens to other gender. It's pretty much the same thing from a biological perspective. And a lot of people will, even though you don't find something in the Quran or something the Prophet taught, will act like any difficulty, like there's some sort of, it has to happen. If the Prophet was sad when he found out that this was going to happen, that means that forever we have to be sad on the days of the year when it happened and bewail. And where does it say that, right? And it actually talks against beating oneself and bewailing and all that. One criticism that I would levy against this book is it talks disparagingly about the minutiae. And yes, you should start with more general principles, but let's be real, there are the narrations about the different specifics that people would ask the Prophet, and we're told not to be too questioning in regards of, making it strict. We want to understand our religion, but, people will make the religion stricter than it has to be, but it's what the Prophet taught. So if you don't understand the ablutions and read more narrations about this, that, and the other about, oh, just how clean does the water have to be in terms of emergencies and that sort of stuff. You know, there's stuff like that that does actually exist, but the point is not to make one's life about talking about, yes, you realize that some deeds are more meritorious than others, and you go after those deeds more than the others, but it all adds up, and, people will say, oh, well, I saw you talk for 2 minutes, and this is what was talked about. It's like, yeah, but is that the life? Is that the lifestyle? The whole thing? Just, in this particular issue, here's this, and, because people will, there's one verse, and they'll give big long lectures lasting over an hour talking about ablutions and all this stuff. And it's like there's chapters and stuff for that. But for the general community, maybe this isn't the thing to focus on, right? One of the things we need to do is that when the news stories and all that other stuff come about, it's just encourage the ethically pleasing and discourage the reprehensible, and of course temper that by some moral consideration, not just, oh, it happens to be the ethics of one group or another. That's all you need to do. You don't need to, because people like say, why don't you condemn this? It's like, that I read the Quran, or this person reads the Quran, or there's hadith books. It's like, I don't have to address anything specific because it's already addressed. That's how you should approach it, not, because people are always out there, because, other groups, they don't get you to that too, how many Christians rape and murder and all sorts of other stuff, how many Jews do it, but do they have to answer and, defend Judaism for that? Oh, at least there's a Bismillah in there. There's a Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Oh, I said I wasn't going to go into all that. In the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful, and, it's an interesting cover. Islam takes a middle ground on all sorts of stuff. When we talk about diversity, it doesn't exactly encourage diversity in the way that people would like it to encourage diversity. Allowing for a variety of thought and encouraging and expanding understanding, that sort of stuff, but not like an issue that did have occur early on was like race mixing. And it's like Islam didn't encourage race mixing. It allowed people to get married that were of different races and stuff like this, but it didn't encourage on the grounds of, oh, you're different. Like nowadays people will encourage people to mix races and tribes and cultures and stuff just to mix. And that's not the point. Diversity for its own sake is not the point. Diversity for function, diversity for some other things, sure. But I'm going to get all sorts of... But I think I've given enough context to that statement to, Oh, and some stuff like, okay, since Islam did not allow wars to extend borders, it did not allow wars to capture slaves, and the rules with slaves made it like, you had to treat them better than modern companies will treat their employees. Countries that, people don't get very low salaries compared to the wealth that they have. So many African countries are third world, but their per capita income is first world. But, those countries, they take higher percentages of it than the first world. That's really the only difference that makes these the way they are. And as far as certain modernist groups, if they want to be direct about their following the earlier examples or following the text correctly for themselves directly, that's fine. It just sometimes helps that, there's some stuff out there. I think I've mentioned in this program, my personal approach is that I try to directly justify. But sometimes when I read a book like this, I will notice something that it's at least a conclusion for others, because you do have to live in society. And an overall agreement is important to realize, or a partial agreement, and how certain intentions might be refined in their application. Because certainly an idea of taking it back to a purity of faith, where you actually understand whether or not this is what the prophet taught. Because a lot of people, they will say, oh, Hanafi taught it, or Hanbali taught it, or it's like, yeah, but what did the prophet himself have to say about that? What was revealed? What was inspired? How can we make that personal? It's not always about who's superior or inferior. It's about encouraging and discouraging of others and yourself. Reasoning is not enough, but the different types of philosophy, if you look at them as functionary, they will support religion. We can look at religion in terms of the authenticity of its sources and in terms of, what it actually is, its context. And from that, we get something that is goodness and truth, and against everything that is evil and ignorant. For the self, for whatever group, for the entirety of those who are responsible for their own outcome. And, if you mess up, pick yourself up and try again. All that can be asked is that people do their best.